What's going on, everyone? Tanner Poppitt here of Madrost and Poppitt's Corner. Just reminding you that our new record, Charring the Rotting Earth, is now available at NoLifeTomatoRecords.com. That's right. Just go in the search bar, type in NoLifeTomatoRecords.com, and support. Again, NoLifeTomatoRecords.com. Now, let's check out the episode you came to see. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Poppitt's Corner. And yes, of course, we got to bring back on the one of the alumni of Poppitt's Corner here. The great Matt Harvey is joining me today. Matt, how you doing, man? Thanks so much for coming on and hanging.
I'm doing really well, man. Thank you for having me back. It's very kind of you to let me come back once again. So
Absolutely. I told you every time you make a new release, you're coming back on the show, you know.
Okay.
So there you go, right?
All right. Well, we'll be talking a lot then.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it, my friend. So yeah, but this is a very kind of special episode because it's not really one of the norm that I would see, not particularly you doing, but you know, a lot of us extreme metal kind of musicians doing, and that is we're going to be obviously, you know, so we're promoting the last Son of Krypton release that I pull it up right here so people can check out the album artwork. Now I'm just kind of curious because I know we one of the interviews that we had done, I'd asked the question where it was, you know, if there was one other kind of musical style you always wanted to do, and I remember you mentioning the movie soundtrack thing, and and now that it's, you know, one of them is out now, how are you feeling about it in particular compared to, say, an extreme metal release that you're so kind of like used to making?
You know, it's really completely different in terms of, you know, the process of making it and what I've, you know, I think the only album that it sort of relates or is similar to is Death Revenge, in that Death Revenge there's a narrative, and then this album has a narrative as well. So it's really it's very, very different. I mean, obviously it's still music and I'm still trying to communicate something via sound, but aside from that, really it's, you know, completely separate. And it's one of those things that in the act of releasing it and creating it and everything, you know, I kind of realized that there may be very, very little overlap with anything that I've ever done before and this album. And, you know, so that kind of, I don't know, it felt like a risk, but that was also kind of exciting, you know?
Sure, but this isn't the first time that you've kind of done a movie soundtrack. I know you've done like Hell Haunt
Right.
a couple years back, which was kind of like you kind of dip your toes in that specific style, and this is a full-fledged like a movie soundtrack that there's not even a movie to it almost, which is kind of cool, you know.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's basically what it is. It's basically it's a soundtrack to a film that doesn't exist, because when working on these kinds of pieces, you know, I had a couple things here and there, and I just sort of realized that if I was going to make something cohesive, that I had to have some sort of narrative to hang the music around, or else it's just going to be like a bunch of stuff. And so that kind of that just sort of latching onto the Superman thing, because it's a concept album about Superman, just to get that out of the way. That sort of gave me a storyline to kind of follow, and then that sort of set the mood for each piece, because it's a kind of music where obviously it's still very much, you know, self-expression and everything, but at the same time, you know, the whole discipline of it is kind of writing to spec. You know, somebody hands you a scene like, oh, this is where they fall in love, and you're like, okay, well, cool, now I got to start writing music about that. Nobody was doing that, so I had to just sort of be like, okay, here's an arbitrary story, so start kind of writing music around these story points, you know.
Sure. So branching off of this, have like the movie? Do you have the movie scenes kind of picked out already, or does the music kind of come first, and then you kind of model it after like, I don't know, said superhero movies, and be like, okay, well this section sounds like it would sound like, in a the love scene, or the
Right.
final battle, or the epic start to the movie. So how do you determine what piece was going to represent what, for this specific album in question?
Um, you know, Basically I kind of started with just a bunch of little melodies that I had worked out over time. And some of them didn't end up getting used, some did, but it kind of all just sort of stemmed from the main theme, the dum ba ba bum 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 bum, and that was something that I came up with a couple years back when Ross, our bass player in Exhumed, who's also he and I, we knew each other through comic books first before we played music together, and we were talking about how we wished that, we spent a lot of time talking about superhero movies and horror and sci-fi and various androids dungeon friendly topics, and we were both sort of lamenting the lack of really optimistic themes in a lot of modern superhero movies. I love the Avengers theme, for example, that Alan Silvestri did, but it's so martial and tough. It doesn't have that like, you're a 3-year-old. There's a hero inside all of us kind
So
of
like
optimism.
that, like kind of innocence almost, I would say.
Yes, exactly. And that was, how I came up with that melody. And anyway, last year was just such a fucking downer year. You know, Economically, culturally, politically, emotionally, like no matter what, I think everybody was having like a shitty year. And I was like, I've had enough doom and gloom. And obviously I was writing an Exhumed album kind of at the same time. And that's very, full of negativity in a lot of ways. And I was like, I just wanted something that was like kind of unashamedly positive and optimistic, and didn't have that sort of irony or that grittiness, that like the Zack Snyder Superman movie had, for example. That was still like a pretty dark film. I wanted something that was just like, hey, good guys are good and they're gonna win, and because I think I needed to feel that kind of optimistic feeling, and so this sort of became my therapy or whatever.
Sure. Well, to branch off it, this year's not much better. I hate to tell. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not.
It's certainly not great. I mean, I do feel like at least things are moving, whereas last year it felt like complete stasis. And I guess there's, so I don't want to get into the whole ills of the world, because
No.
I'm not qualified to fix them or anything else. But, for me personally, I feel like this year has some more optimism. But, I just felt like that's what I was missing. And so, hopefully there's somebody out there in a similar state that maybe will hear this and it's like, oh, this is like, this hits something for me,
Well, that's exactly what it did for me, because
cool.
that's why, like I told you, kind of behind the scenes here, this is probably one of my favorite albums that you have done in your career, period.
Well, thanks,
just
man.
because, and it might be because I'm a fellow nerd. Like, I really love movie soundtracks a lot. I've always kind of said that movie soundtracks are almost like the last bastion to what classical music was. It's like that big orchestral kind of vibe. And the three composers I heard listening to this album, again and again and again, were John Williams, John Carpenter, and Jerry Goldsmith. Like, all three of those, for some reason, made it for me into this album. And I just thought it, because I love all three of those composers, and I'm hopefully, who I'm talking about. But,
absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
But it just felt like the best of all of that encompassed into one record. And I just really dug it so much. Obviously, I pre-ordered it, which we'll get into that way later in this, interview. But, like, I just felt the optimism that you wanted to portray, I guess, from that Yeah. So
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of all three of the composers that you mentioned. I think Goldsmith he's such kind of an underrated craftsman, because the thing that I love about him is that he does stuff that is so utterly different. The Chinatown soundtrack sounds nothing like The Omen, which sounds nothing like Alien, which sounds nothing like the Star Trek movies he's done, which sounds nothing like Space Jam. You know what I mean? Like, he's fucking does everything.
and nothing like Rambo.
Right. Oh yeah. Dude, I was actually listening to that a couple months
Classic,
ago.
dude.
The It's a Hard Road song is just such a great song.
From Rambo First Blood Part 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just anyway. And I think John Williams might be sort of the most skilled composer really of our lifetime. But he kind of, I feel like Goldsmith is neat because he's able to submerge his personality almost completely within the narrative of the film. Whereas John Williams, Harry Potter and Star Wars, like, they don't really have that much in common, but you can still be like, oh, this is John Williams, because he sort of, and he's amazing. I mean, I think he's kind of like the best. I don't know if he's my favorite, but he's done some of my favorite movies. And certainly growing up, film music is some of the first music that I remember. And John Williams with Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back and Superman and Superman 2 is a huge part of that,
Absolutely. I still will argue with many people that Superman is probably my all-time favorite superhero movie still to this day.
The first one?
The Christopher Reeves 1977.
It's either 77 or I think that's right. I like Superman 2 even better, but they're both amazing.
Well, I just think Richard Donner's his vision, I just felt was so like innocent or whatever in the first one. So that's what I kind of gravitated towards, was because I didn't see Christopher Reeves playing Superman. I saw fucking Superman.
You just saw Superman, right?
He was. I think all the pieces just came together so well and perfect during that specific movie for me. But everyone has their favorites, right? So
I mean, I certainly would put Superman. For me, Superman 2 was the one, because I wanted Lex Luthor to be scarier, I guess, and that was my only quibble with Superman with the first one. And I guess that's sort of what I try to do on this album, is portray Lex Luthor the way that I think of him. That's my only quibble. Whereas in Superman 2, I felt like he really got some villains that were a real physical challenge, because it's one of the problems with Superman comics too, is that he's so fucking powerful. It's difficult to find somebody that can stand up to him. And you know what I mean? Like, some of his villains are like, really, Toy Man? Like, I think Superman can handle this dude. Like, I think he's going to be okay. And that's what, that's why I like Superman 2, I guess, even better. And, when I was a kid, I just thought that was like, that and Empire Strikes Back were like the yin and yang, of my childhood.
Absolutely. I mean, how can I ask you, personally, do you ever see yourself being like a John Carpenter kind of composer, where you're going to direct a movie, score it, write it? Because, obviously John Carpenter is one of those rare instances where he literally does everything for a movie. Like They Live, I think he literally did almost everything for it.
He wrote it, he directed it, and
produced it, he did the score. I
mean, he's like the ultimate DIY, like, punk rock guy. And I think, and I didn't really touch on Carpenter before, but I think coming from a rock metal background, you can't help but have some Carpenter, because Carpenter writes riffs. You know what I mean? Like,
it's so true.
Goldsmith and John Williams don't really write riffs. Williams writes hooks, like the best hooks, but Carpenter writes just riffs. I mean, da 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 da. It's a death riff. It's. I mean, that's what it is.
Escape from New York, perfect example of a melody that literally, gets stuck in my head all the time.
Right. And I love the economy of his composing. And it's, it's it's one of those things where it's so simple and it's such a contrast to, those other composers we mentioned. And that's what makes it really striking, because if you're writing just an okay symphonic score, it's tough to hang versus Jerry Goldsmith. But if you have just a fucking synthesizer, it's like, well, this is going to stick out no matter what. And he, because he wrote the movies and he directed the movies, no one knows better than him where the music should go, where it shouldn't go, and he's able to kind of get so much more out of so much less music. And also, writing this album, obviously I don't have a symphony orchestra. It's just me on a computer manipulating MIDI. And, there was so many kind of things that I had to learn how to do in the process of making this record. And so using synth sounds was an advantage because it didn't really, you knew there were synthesizers. And so you didn't have to worry, like, does this sound like a real cello section? It's like, it's fucking synthesizer. It's just like, cool. Like we can lean into this a little bit, because it was really an engineering challenge to learn how to try and make realistic sounding instruments and stuff.
Sure. I would really be curious though, like say you did make the movie, produced it and wrote the score. I wonder how much of a challenge that would be as compared to say what you did on Last Son of Krypton, where you literally had no movie. You literally had you produced a soundtrack, and maybe this too, just food for thought. Maybe there will be a movie where you use a soundtrack and kind of do the opposite, where you do the score first and then the movie. So right. I mean,
well, I think it helps that I hesitate to say I'm a writer, but I mean, I did like publish a short story in a book last year. So, I mean, I'm not a writer, but I'm not like a writer. It sounds pretentious to say it out loud, but I do sort of have a sense of narrative and, it's very much a 3-act story where the characters are introduced. Brainiac shows up, Rex shop, and our heroes on the ropes. That's sort of act 2. Then act 3, of course, he's able to come back and win. And, and then there's like a brief epilogue, which would be sort of like if you wanted to set up the sequel or whatever. So there is a narrative in the music itself. And, it's sort of secondary because I assume most people know the story about how he comes to Earth in a fucking rocket ship from Krypton because Krypton's blowing up. It's like, yeah, okay, we get it, So instead of saying that, there's a song about it, and maybe that's kind of, because it is such a universal kind of mythic story, just like Moses floating down the fucking river in the basket. I mean, it sort of evokes all of those things, the orphan, whether it's Luke Skywalker or Peter Parker or whatever, Harry Potter. Again, there's this sort of universal mythic story. And so telling it with music is, maybe more refreshing than beating the shit out of it again, because everyone knows Krypton blew up, fucking rocket, get on with it. Yeah. Come on.
Absolutely. But so going off of this point here real quick is, obviously extreme metal itself kind of has its own niche audience, right? I feel with this specific release in question that you could obtain more, you can reach a wider audience with this, even if, many of us aren't, we don't read, I don't read comics every day or whatever it is. So I don't know like the ins and outs to Superman, but I love the movies and whatnot. So, but I feel with this soundtrack in question is, I feel it can pertain to more than just the extreme, the people looking for extreme music obviously will kind of dig this because there's a lot of correlation between composing extreme music and like a movie soundtrack or classical music in general. But I feel you kind of don't have to like anything Matt Harvey's done in his extreme metal career to dig this record. I just feel it kind of stands on its own for me.
I think it's very much a separate thing. And, as I was, making it, I kind of thought, I'm like, what is this for? Who is the audience? Because, if you're into death metal, this isn't necessarily for you. And even if you're into, the more symphonic kind of metal bands, like, I'm not super big on symphonic metal, so I could be way off, but I think like Flesh God Apocalypse, right? They have a lot of like cinematic stuff. I know Nile certainly does. And even if you're into that, I don't know that this would necessarily resonate with you because it's tonally all over the place. You know what I mean? Like the first song is kind of this like heroic overture, and even as the album goes on, there's a lot of kind of darkness and conflict that probably, if you're in denial, you might like the middle of the album where Brainiac comes and levels Metropolis and all that kind of stuff, because it's a lot darker. And then but the end and the beginning are really optimistic. And I thought maybe if you have a tabletop role-playing group and you need like some music to set the mood, like this would be good. If you, I don't know, I like to exercise like movie soundtracks.
Sure. Well, and let me branch off at this point too. I think if you're a fan of movies, this is definitely a record that can pertain to you, I would say. I really do feel like this stands on its own, and
cool.
And it's just I really enjoyed this specific record. So obviously awesome. I'm stoked to have you on here and get the opportunity to promote it. So it's like
thanks,
it's man. Just really crazy that it actually came to fruition, because I know you had always kind of wanted to do something like this. So
yeah, it was definitely not that every album isn't a labor of love or a passion project or whatever, but this one specifically really was, because it's not like, it was just me. I got a lot of advice as far as the production and stuff from other people, but it was just me working on it. There's nobody pushing me. And it certainly wasn't like, the record label was like, hey, isn't it time for a new album? Like, shouldn't you guys be going on tour? It was just like, well, this is something that's really just for me, and hopefully, like I said, hopefully it resonates with people, and it's also the kind of thing I was thinking, if you're into sci-fi and adventure movies and film, one of the things that a buddy of mine said, he's like, yeah, just take like fat bong rips and listen to it, and like the movie just happens in my mind and I'm stoked. And I was like,
well, and it's a perfect driving record too. It's literally, you can put in your car and just take the drive, and
right.
It's that good, as well. Now, for you personally, let me ask you this. Would this soundtrack be better suited with Christopher Reeves playing Superman era? Because it kind of has, like, the beginning track kind of has that John Williams kind of feel to it. Or would it be Man of Steel kind of era Superman? Like, what would you pick if you kind of had to decide this soundtrack's going to be, Superman's going to be played by so-and-so?
I would always pick Christopher Reeve simply because that's who I grew up with. And I really think that, like, despite my complaints about Lex Luthor, I think Richard Donner captured the essence of the character. I think Henry Cavill looks awesome as Superman. And I feel for myself, I don't think that the faults I find with the movies he's in have nothing to do with him. I think he's perfectly fine and could probably really give me what I wanted as a fan. However, Zack Snyder's vision is totally different than how I perceive Superman, and that's fine. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just not what I would do. And honestly, I love the Man of Steel score by Hans Zimmer. I think is a fucking fantastic score. Absolutely. To me, it doesn't feel like Superman, but the way it does feel like that movie. And I think so. I'm not trying to, put myself up there and be like, I know better than Warner. It's like, whatever. This is just, for me as a fan, like I said, last year was discouraging. So I needed something that made me feel optimistic. And for me, that's what Superman is. So that's why I made the record about it.
Absolutely. Now I do have like a little tidbit, because technically this is the first solo album from Matt Harvey, but I kind of wanted to touch upon the Hell Haunt release and whatnot, and just where was your head at during that time compared to, say, nowadays with wanting to write a full-length record this time?
Well, I did Hell Haunt working with a Canadian director, and basically I just sort of worked up themes for each character and then kind of combined two themes into the main theme. And that's kind of how the story worked. But it's a very short film. It's like a 15-minute film. And, I didn't really necessarily write to picture. I just wrote the themes, and then the sound designer interspersed them as they felt fit and made their own decisions, really. I think the main, so much has changed because that was a few years back. That was like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I guess.
2017.
Okay, 4 years ago, yeah. So for me, so much has really changed since then because, that was kind of after I arranged some of the stuff for the Death Revenge album, and then my buddy Matt Widener, who used to play bass for Exhumed, he played in Krypton and County Medical Examiners and stuff. He kind of came in and produced the tracks and then helped me with some of the arrangements and stuff. And since then, I mean, I think of kind of what I knew and what my approach was back then. And it's kind of like, listening to your first demo like 4 years later, and you're like, fuck, I had no idea. And, really with this kind of music, even more so than, music in general, but even more so than metal it is really limitless, the only real kind of constraint is just evoking whatever the narrative is supposed to be. So if that's done by recording, banging spoons on a counter, then that's what works. If it's done using a string quartet, that's what works. If it's done using a synthesizer or whatever, there's no real limits there. So, just to kind of get the scope of the toolkit that you have access to is really mind-blowing, coming from metal, where it's like, well, you got 2 guitars, a drum kit, bass, couple vocals, then maybe some leads and some melodies and stuff, and just trying to learn what the fucking sections of the orchestra are, what they do, what every instrument sounds like, and then how to produce it, how to simulate it, how to mix it. I mean, it was like, really, this album took so long to create, and because it's very interdisciplinary, and I'm still, I have lots and lots to learn, and I'm continuing to learn. So I mean, my mindset is almost utterly different. And I also realize that now, if you're writing for a movie that's 15 minutes long, you don't actually need leitmotifs for any of the characters, because chances are there's not very many characters, and so you're going to just end up using the same music in every scene, and that's just a clusterfuck. And luckily, the sound designer knew better than I did and just used the themes in a totally different way,
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just been a huge journey since then, as on all fronts.
Now, one of the only things that you haven't done besides directing a movie per se is doing a book on yourself, and I'm kind of curious. Is that something that you would actually, kind of want to do? I mean, you like to read books. Obviously, you're a comic book guy. Would that be something that you would kind of consider doing? Is like an autobiography of yourself?
I think that no, I've never really thought about that. I mean, I do like to talk about myself, as anyone who's seen our previous episodes will attest to, but I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I think that, my life itself is not terribly interesting. And whenever you're reading like music biographies, generally it's the life. If the life is not interesting, then it becomes really dry and technical really fast. And that personally interests me, but it doesn't really make for a compelling read. Like, I remember reading one of the Kiss, I think it was Gene Simmons' book, and I was like, I don't really care about like your sex life and your money. Like, I'm like, so like, how did you guys record Hotter Than Hell? Like, what? Like, let's get into that. And that's the kind of details that really are not terribly interesting to, a wider, even within the music scene, a wider audience.
Now, is that because of the wider audience are not musicians, right? We have the musician kind of brain, as I call it. Like,
yes,
I'm the same way, which is obviously
right.
Why what I do what I do, right?
Right.
But I totally agree about but like the movie soundtrack, obviously you did it for you, but I'm just saying the book could be like that too, where it's like you do it for you, right? You have something that's going to outlive you and kind of document your life. So that's why I was just asking the question.
I appreciate it, but yeah, no, as a person, I'm not terribly interesting. I mean, hopefully the work that I do is I mean, to me, that's kind of like, that's what's interesting. And I guess sort of my story or whatever, my own journey is in the records as well. It's not like a narrative, like like you would write down, but it is kind of just my progression through whatever it is I'm trying to work out, honing my craft or whatever you want to call it,
Now, were any of the tracks on the last Son of Krypton, were they written on guitar for you, or did you kind of just pick an instrument and say, I'm going to write something around this specific instrument? Because it's, again, you have way more tools to play with than say
right.
Guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. So it's like, and obviously there's a correlation between, like we said earlier, extreme metal and classical and whatnot. There's a lot of layers and whatnot. So I was just curious.
Well, it's in terms of the composition style, it's really been a long process where when Exhumed started back up again in 2011, and we were kind of looking at playing live and so on and so forth. Obviously we've had a lot of different members, we're like the fucking grindcore Deep Purple or whatever. So I realized that, even when we were starting back up, if we were going to continue, that Leon and Danny weren't going to keep playing with us and so on. And so I was like, what I should do is I should start transcribing everything so that when somebody comes into the band, I'm able to say, these are the songs to learn. Here's the tablature, learn it. And then obviously come to me with whatever questions. And so once I kind of embarked on that process, it was a big learning curve really for like the first couple of years, just in terms of getting comfortable knowing what note values are and stuff. Cause I never took lessons or any of that shit. I had to, so as time went on and I kept transcribing and every album we would write, I would transcribe, obviously I got a lot more proficient at it, but I also started thinking in terms of composition that was not necessarily tied to the instrument. I could just sit down and be like, I have this riff in my head and I could just write it down and be like, all right, well, cool. That was pretty close to what I was thinking. And as time has evolved, I find that my hands on the guitar, the muscle memory tends to stick you into familiar patterns. Whereas if I'm just composing purely from my mind to the transcription, it's kind of unmoored from the physical habits that I've created. And so really almost everything is just me sitting down and, just working things out note by note, instrument by instrument, part by part, and, composing primarily using like a tablature program, but just composing for different voices and then plugging that in to the instruments. And then of course, making changes again, once you have once you're hearing the actual instrument voice, you'd be like, oh, I thought this was really clever, but this actually sucks. Or I thought this part would be good for this instrument, but it should go on, from instrument X to instrument Y or whatever. And, so really, I still think of where the notes are in terms of guitar, like a C sharp is like, oh, okay, that's there. But in terms of the actual composition, it's really all just brain to keyboard, not like a keyboard, like with notes, like the QWERTY keyboard. But one of the things that I do want to do after doing this record, and I recognize would be a very handy tool set, would be to learn to become a pianist. I know how to play piano, just like I know how to play drums, and like I know where the fucking notes are and I know how to make chords, but I couldn't like sit down and play like Fur Elise or anything like that on piano. I could maybe bang out like Phantasm, da 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 da,
like the Halloween theme song or something.
Yeah, that's about my ability level right now. So,
but obviously piano and guitar are very similar in terms of the approach to it and whatnot. Now, is there going to be a part 2 to this? Do you want to do, and if so, how would you want to make this different than say, the last Son of Krypton, would you want to make like a bonus disc where it's like a 15-minute movie and then you put, you make, I'd be really cool to see something like that,
Well, I think, I mean, I would, part of me, I'm definitely, I've already been continuing composing music in this vein. And my current project is I'm sort of just working on a demo reel to send to people that are working on film projects. Like there's a Western theme, there's a sci-fi theme, there's an adventure theme, there's a like a period piece type theme, like, a Downton Abbey kind of like string quartet, like Victorian thing. There's like a Tim Burton-y kind of whimsical theme, a horror theme, etc. But if I was to continue this story, the epilogue piece that, I mean, I guess the easiest way to explain it is just I'll try and do this quickly. But basically the storyline is this: the rocket ship lands in Smallville, the Kents take the baby away. In this sort of iteration, my concept is that Lex Luthor also comes and retrieves part of the wreckage of the ship and takes it back to Metropolis. Obviously he's like 20 years older than Superman, at least at this point. And Superman grows up in Smallville, all that small town Americana shit. He moves to Metropolis to become an investigative reporter. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor is tinkering with the Kryptonian technology he's been trying to work on for 20 years. He finally sort of, turns it on, which brings Brainiac to Earth because Brainiac is responsible for the destruction of Krypton. Brainiac shows up. Superman has to be like, well, I guess this is the time. I wasn't sure if I should become a hero, but clearly I'm the only one that can maybe stop this. He fights Brainiac. Brainiac kicks his ass, essentially. Lex Luthor says, I was kind of holding this close to my vest, but I also don't want Metropolis or the Earth to get destroyed. But there's more Kryptonian shit in Antarctica or where, so you need to go there and probably figure this out. So he gets Superman to the Fortress of Solitude, where he gets healed up, and he learns that the missing piece of technology to help him defeat Brainiac is actually something that Luthor has in Metropolis. He goes back to Metropolis and he's like, yo, and Luthor's like, I'll give this to you, but you can't tell anybody that this is technically my fault. Like, I'll help you fix this, but you got to do something for me. And Superman's like, I have no choice. The city's at stake, blah, blah, blah. So he defeats Brainiac. He goes home a hero. And of course, the ironic twist is that now Lex Luthor is also a hero as Superman's buddy. And in the end, the sort of post-credit scene or whatever is that Brainiac's damaged ship is floating off into space, where it comes across, the old floating mirror with the Phantom Zone inmates. And that's like
awesome.
That's the end. And you're like, oh, fuck. So I guess part 2 would be sort of, Lex Luthor's ascent to even further power in ways that Superman is not equipped to combat because he's, a rich businessman. Superman can't go shut down his fucking business. So he's sort of dealing with that complex earthly kind of evil while Brainiac unleashes the, General Zod and his crew that have been in the Phantom Zone. They come to Earth and wreak even more havoc. And, that's kind of what my idea for a part 2 would be. So you have this sort of complicated real life level. How do you really stop evil? Like, how do you stop Jeff Bezos? Like, I don't know. That's fucking, the guy's rich. Like, what can he do? You can't make him not build a dumbass spaceship. I don't know. You can't just go kick his ass. And then you have the other superhero story where you can just go and kick their ass. That's kind of nice,
I would like to see that movie. There you go. Right. So man, I want to thank you again for giving me a few minutes of your time and helping me promote this record. Cause like I said, it's one of my now favorite things that you've done. I look forward to getting the CD in the mail, but where can people find this? If they want either the physical media or the digital.
Digitally, you can stream it at all the usual suspects: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. Pick your sort of corporate vampire of choice, and you're probably already giving them your money, so you can go there. It's also on the Relapse YouTube channel, and it's on my YouTube channel. Well, technically, It's not at the time of this taping, but literally after we get done, that's the next thing on my to-do list. So it will be on my YouTube channel. And you can find the CD at the darkercorners.bigcartel.com web store that has all Exhumed stuff, gruesome stuff, Pounder stuff, and this CD. And you can also check out my website, which is mattharveymustbedestroyed.com, that has all of the same info and more info about the making of the album and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, thank you very much again for coming on and hanging with me. I really always appreciate your company and promoting what you got, man. It means a lot. So
I appreciate your support, man. It's always an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, another episode of Poppitt's Corner, guys. We're out.
Cheers.
Cheers.